The little boy's voice was barely louder than the clatter of plates, but it stopped his father cold. "Dad, they haven't eaten." Across the bright restaurant, a tired mother sat beside her young daughter, pretending not to notice the smell of warm food filling the room. The girl kept her eyes lowered, while her mother quietly pushed an empty glass back and forth across the table. What the single father did next would change 4 lives before the sun went down. Before we begin this heart-touching story, please take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to Kindness Corner 2.0 if you believe in kindness, second chances, and the power of helping someone when nobody else does. It was a clear summer afternoon in the city of Brookhaven, and sunlight poured through the tall windows of a small family restaurant on a busy downtown street. 36-year-old Elias Mercer sat at a corner table with his 8-year-old son, Theo. Elias had spent the morning repairing air conditioning units across the city, and the faint marks of honest work still showed on his sleeves. He was a single father, and every dollar mattered. Since his wife had passed away several years earlier, he had learned how to be both parent and provider, even on days when exhaustion made his feet feel twice as heavy. Theo, however, had inherited something from his mother that money could never buy, an unusually sensitive heart. They had come to the restaurant because Elias had promised Theo a proper lunch after a difficult week at school. Theo had chosen a simple grilled cheese sandwich, while Elias had ordered soup and bread. It wasn't an expensive meal, but to them it felt like a small celebration. They were talking quietly when Theo suddenly stopped eating. His eyes moved toward a table near the window. Elias followed his son's gaze and saw them. A woman in her early 30s sat with a little girl who looked about 7. The mother, Maren Vale, wore a simple blue cardigan and kept her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her daughter, Elsie, wore a faded pink dress and white sneakers that had clearly seen better days. On their tables sat 2 menus, 2 glasses of water, and nothing else. At first, Elias thought they were simply waiting for their food. But several minutes passed. The waitress walked by twice, and the mother politely shook her head each time. Then Elsie leaned close to her mother and whispered something. Maren smiled, touched the girl's hair, and pointed toward the window as though trying to distract her. Theo leaned toward his father. "Dad, they haven't eaten." Elias looked at his own plate. His soup was still warm. Theo's sandwich was half finished. He knew exactly what his bank account looked like. He had rent due in 4 days. His truck needed a repair. Theo needed new school shoes before autumn. There was no comfortable room in his budget for unexpected kindness. But then he looked again at the little girl. She wasn't complaining. She wasn't asking anyone for help. She was simply sitting beside her mother, trying very hard to be patient. Elias knew that look. It was the look of a child who had learned too early that adults sometimes had problems they couldn't fix. He remembered Theo at 5 years old, sitting beside him after his mother died, asking whether they could still have birthdays even if their family was smaller. Elias had held his son that night and promised that no matter how difficult life became, they would never let hardship steal all the warmth from their home. He reached for his wallet. There were 3 $20 bills, a 10, and a few smaller notes. Theo watched him carefully. Elias quietly called the waitress and asked her to bring a meal for the mother and daughter, along with something sweet for the child. He told her not to mention who had ordered it. The waitress nodded. A few minutes later, 2 plates arrived at Maren and Elsie's table. Maren looked confused. She immediately asked the waitress whether there had been a mistake. The waitress simply smiled and said that their lunch had already been taken care of. Maren looked around the restaurant. Her eyes finally met Elias's. He gave her a small nod and returned to his son. Elsie smiled when she saw the food, but Maren hesitated. Pride fought against necessity in her expression. Finally, she placed her hand over her daughter's and let her eat. Theo watched the little girl take her first bite. He smiled. Elias smiled too. For a few minutes, everything seemed simple. Then Maren stood and walked toward their table. "Thank you," she said quietly. Elias shook his head. "You don't have to thank me." "I do," Maren replied. "You don't know what this means." Elias glanced at Elsie. "I think I do." Maren's eyes became glossy, but she quickly looked away. She explained that she had recently lost her job at a local printing company after the business closed. She had been searching for work ever since. That morning, she had brought Elsie downtown because she had an interview scheduled nearby. Unfortunately, the interview had been postponed until the following week. Maren had only enough money left for their bus fare home. She had brought Elsie into the restaurant because the afternoon was hot, and she didn't want her daughter standing outside. "I thought we could just sit for a while," she admitted. Elias nodded. "Sometimes sitting somewhere cool is all you can afford." Maren looked at him with surprise. He wasn't judging her. He understood. Elias told her that he had also known what it felt like to count every bill before buying groceries. He didn't tell her everything. He didn't need to. Their conversation ended when Theo offered Elsie half of his dessert. Elias raised an eyebrow, but Theo simply shrugged. "There's enough," he said. Elsie smiled for the first time. The four of them spent the next 20 minutes talking about school, favorite books, and the strange things children found funny. For a short while, the problems waiting outside seemed far away. But when Maren prepared to leave, Elias noticed something that made him pause. She had folded a small piece of paper and slipped it into her daughter's hand. After they walked away, Elias realized it was a drawing. Theo had noticed too. "Dad, why did she give her that?" "I don't know," Elias said. They paid their bill and stepped outside. The afternoon was bright, warm, and busy. Cars moved through the intersection, people hurried along sidewalks, and bicycles passed beneath the trees. Then Elias saw Maren and Elsie standing at a bus stop. The bus sign showed that the next one would arrive in 25 minutes. Elsie looked tired. Elias glanced at Theo. Theo already knew what his father was thinking. They walked toward them. "I can drive you home," Elias offered. Maren immediately shook her head. "No, you've already done enough. It isn't a problem." She hesitated. Elias smiled. "It's hot, and I have a truck parked nearby. Let me help." After a moment, she accepted. During the drive, Elsie sat beside Theo in the back seat. The two children talked about school and animals. Maren sat in the passenger seat, looking out the window. Then she quietly said, "You know, I almost didn't come into that restaurant." Elias glanced at her. "I was embarrassed," she continued. "I kept thinking someone would recognize that I couldn't afford anything." Elias shook his head. "Needing help isn't something to be ashamed of." Maren looked at him. "Sometimes," Elias said, "the hardest thing isn't giving. It's allowing someone else to give." Those words stayed with her. When they reached Maren's small apartment building, Elias noticed that several grocery bags sat beside the entrance. One bag had torn, and canned food had rolled onto the pavement. Without hesitation, Elias got out and helped gather everything. Theo helped too. Maren watched them, speechless. Inside the apartment, Elias realized how little food there was. There was a small loaf of bread, a few vegetables, and some rice. He didn't say anything. Instead, he asked Maren whether she would be willing to meet someone he knew. That someone was a manager at a local repair company who had been looking for an office assistant. Elias wasn't promising her a job, but he could give her a chance to be seen. The following morning, Maren went to the interview. She got the job. It wasn't glamorous, and it didn't solve every problem overnight. But it gave her steady hours, dignity, and a way forward. Weeks passed. Maren worked hard. Elsie returned to school with renewed confidence. Theo and Elsie became close friends, often exchanging drawings and stories. And Elias discovered something unexpected. The kindness he had offered that afternoon had come back into his own life in ways he never expected. One evening, Elias's old truck finally broke down. He stood beside it on a quiet street, frustrated and worried. He couldn't afford the repair immediately. Then a car stopped nearby. Maren stepped out. She had remembered a mechanic who offered affordable work through the company where she now worked. She had called him. Within an hour, the truck was being repaired. Elias laughed when he realized what had happened. He had once helped someone because he thought they needed him. He never expected that person to become part of the reason he could keep moving forward. Months later, Maren received a promotion. She eventually moved into a better apartment, and Elsie joined a school art program. Theo continued visiting her after school. One sunny Saturday, the four of them returned to the same restaurant. This time, Maren paid for lunch. Elias tried to protest, but she wouldn't let him. She placed a plate in front of Theo and another in front of Elsie. Then she looked at Elias and smiled. "You taught us something that day," she said. "You taught us that one small act can become a bridge between strangers." Elias looked around the restaurant. The same sunlight streamed through the windows. The same tables stood beneath the glass. But everything felt different. Theo leaned toward his father and whispered, "Dad, remember when they hadn't eaten?" Elias smiled. "Yes." Theo looked at Elsie and grinned. "Now nobody at our table eats alone." Elias felt his eyes grow warm. He finally understood that kindness wasn't about having enough money to solve someone's entire life. Sometimes kindness was simply noticing. Noticing the empty plate. Noticing the tired face. Noticing the child who was trying not to ask. And choosing to care. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who believes in kindness, and subscribe to Kindness Corner 2.0. Your support helps these stories reach people who may need a reminder that compassion still exists. And before the story ends, leave a comment saying, "Kindness can change a life," if you believe that even one small act of goodness can make someone's difficult day a little brighter. Because sometimes, the person sitting quietly in the corner isn't asking to be rescued. They are only hoping that someone will notice. And sometimes, one father, one child, one meal, and one simple decision to care can turn an ordinary afternoon into the beginning of a completely different life. That day, Elias thought he had bought lunch for a hungry mother and daughter. He was wrong. What he had really given them was hope. And in return, they reminded him that even when life feels heavy, there is always room at the table for kindness.